The great hall shimmered with light drawn from 1,000 jeweled lanterns, their glow reflected on columns of translucent crystal. Nobles from across the empire stood in orderly rows, their elegant robes trailing across marble floors veined with gold. Tonight was the choosing, a ceremony meant to bind the future of the empire through unions of power. Suitors stepped forward one by one, announcing their selections with voices that carried authority. Murmurs of approval or dismay swept the room like waves as alliances were forged. And at the farthest end of the hall, beneath the elevated dais where the empress sat, stood her daughter, the princess no one ever chose. She kept her spine rigid, her chin lifted, though her stomach twisted. Her emerald crown, heavy with stones, pressed against her temples. This was her third choosing, and once again the line of suitors skirted past her. She tried not to watch them, but her eyes betrayed her, flicking to each noble youth as they passed. Some hesitated, perhaps out of pity, but none spoke her name. Her people whispered that she was cursed, that her bloodline bore a flaw hidden from sight. The sting of their rejection burned more than the jeweled weight upon her head. The empress regarded her with an unreadable gaze, lips set in a stern line. To falter beneath that gaze would be to confirm every whisper. So the princess stood unmoving, her breath measured, her hands clasped before her in stillness. She had trained for years to appear untouchable, yet the ache of solitude pierced her armor. Around her, companions exchanged victorious smiles with their chosen partners, laughter bubbling up like bright fountains. At the far edge of the chamber, among the lesser envoys, a group of humans stood. They were small compared to the towering alien races gathered here, clothed in simple diplomatic garb rather than gowns woven from starlight. No one spared them more than a passing glance. Humans were tolerated, but rarely respected. They were known for adaptability, for persistence, yet not for power. What value could such fragile beings offer an empire that measured worth in dominance? And yet, as her gaze drifted unwillingly to the crowd, she found herself caught by the eyes of one human man. He was not remarkable, his hair a common brown, his posture cautious as though uncertain of his right to even stand in the hall. But his eyes held no derision, no pity either. He looked at her simply, directly, as though she were not cursed, not forgotten, but only herself. That steady look unsettled her more than all the cruel whispers. The last suitor completed his declaration, kneeling before another noblewoman. Applause filled the chamber, sealing the ceremony. All had been chosen except her. The silence that followed was louder than the applause. The empress's expression tightened and whispers spread like smoke. Again overlooked, the cursed one. Even beauty cannot disguise her flaw. Something in her chest snapped. Years of humiliation compressed into a single spark, and before reason could intervene, she stepped forward. The crowd hushed. Her footsteps echoed against the marble as she crossed the hall, skirts of emerald silk flowing behind her. She did not pause before the noblemen who had scorned her. She did not turn toward the alien dignitaries who smirked at her boldness. She walked straight to the cluster of humans. Every eye followed her, disbelieving. The human envoy stiffened, clearly alarmed, and the young man whose gaze had unsettled her shifted uncertainly. Up close, she could see the faint lines of weariness at his eyes, the modest cut of his jacket, the nervousness in his clenched hands. Still, he looked at her without mockery. She drew a breath, feeling the hall grow taut with expectation. "Will you be my husband?" Her voice carried, firm and clear, ringing against the vaulted ceiling. Gasps erupted. A ripple of shock swept the assembly. Some laughed in disbelief, others cried out in outrage. The human ambassador stammered, face pale. The empress rose half from her seat, eyes blazing. But the princess held her ground, her words hanging in the charged air. The young man stared at her as though the universe had tilted. His lips parted, but no sound came. Around him, his fellow humans murmured in panic, urging him to refuse, to step back, to do anything but stand frozen beneath the weight of her demand. The empress's voice cut through the uproar, sharp as steel. "Daughter, what madness is this?" The princess turned toward her mother only briefly, enough to let the court see her resolve. Then she faced the human again. The chamber might despise her for what she had done, but she felt, for the first time, alive in her defiance. She had been denied choice all her life, cast aside, and branded unworthy. Tonight she had chosen. The young man's eyes flickered with conflict, as though caught between fear and something else, something dangerously close to awe. The silence stretched unbearably, the hall waiting for his answer. The princess felt the press of 1,000 stares, the sharp edge of judgment, the weight of a dynasty balanced on her single act. And still, she refused to look away from him. She had asked, and for the first time in her life, she would not retreat from what she wanted. The hall held its breath. Daniel Ward had never felt smaller than he did standing in that hall. Every towering figure turned toward him. He had been a shadow in the Empire's courts for months, scribbling notes, recording cultural practices, and quietly making himself invisible. Humans were safer that way. They were observers, not participants. But now, with a single sentence from the alien princess, he had become the center of the galaxy's cruelest joke. Her words echoed still, clear, deliberate, impossible. "Will you be my husband?" He wanted to laugh, to protest, to shake his head and retreat back into obscurity, but his voice caught in his throat. He could only stare at her. Her eyes, bright as molten emeralds, did not waver. She seemed utterly calm, though he knew it, had taken reckless courage to speak. The hall erupted in outrage. Nobles snarled, their jeweled garments rustling as they leaned toward one another in disbelief. The alien ambassador of the Talari spat that it was an insult, a degradation of their sacred rituals. Even among the humans, panic spread like wildfire. His superior tugged at his sleeve, hissing under his breath for him to deny her quickly, before their entire mission collapsed. "This isn't a game, Daniel," the ambassador whispered furiously. "Refuse her, now." Daniel opened his mouth, but nothing emerged. He wasn't sure what refusal even sounded like under 1,000 watchful eyes. He felt as though he were drowning, yet she gave him no chance to slip beneath the tide. She had not broken eye contact since she'd spoken. There was no mockery there, no malice, only a kind of steady sincerity that unsettled him more than the laughter ringing from the balconies. The Empress's voice struck like thunder. "Daughter, you will retract this shame." Her tone carried both command and threat. But the princess shook her head, the jeweled crown upon her brow glinting defiantly. Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't theater. She wasn't jesting at his expense. She had meant it, and that terrified him more than mockery ever could. He was a cultural attaché, nothing more. He had no lineage, no power, no claim to even stand before her, let alone share her throne. The absurdity of it should have freed him, should have made refusal simple. Yet when he tried to speak, the words still caught. Later, when the storm of voices subsided, he found himself ushered into a side chamber. Guards towered at the doors, their armor glowing faintly with the pulse of energy fields. His superiors berated him, their faces tight with anger and fear. "Do you understand what's at stake?" they demanded. "Our entire relationship with the Empire could be destroyed by this farce. You must denounce her tomorrow, publicly." Daniel nodded mutely, though his mind spun. He understood politics well enough. The Empire dealt in dominance, in bloodlines, in strength. For their princess to lower herself to a human was a scandal that could unravel alliances. And yet her face returned to him again and again. That look in her eyes as she stood before him, surrounded by contempt, had not been desperation. It had been choice. When the chamber emptied, she came to him. The guards let her pass without hesitation, as though her will outweighed all law. She dismissed them with a flick of her hand, leaving them alone in the glow of wall crystals. For a long moment she said nothing, only studied him with that same unsettling directness. "I chose you," she said at last, her voice softer than it had been in the hall. "Do you know why?" Daniel swallowed, shaking his head. "Because it makes a spectacle?" he asked bitterly. A faint smile touched her lips, though it held no humor. "Because you looked at me as if I were not cursed. Everyone else averts their eyes, or lets them linger with pity. You did neither. You simply saw me." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do you know what it means to live unseen, Daniel Ward? his answer caught in his throat. He did know. Humans had been treated as footnotes in every council meeting he had attended, as tolerated guests in the grand narrative of greater races. They were weak, fragile, inconsequential, except for their persistence. And perhaps that was why her words pierced him so deeply. "You don't understand what you're asking," he whispered, forcing steadiness into his tone. "Your people will hate you for this. They'll hate me. If I say yes, I'll bring ruin to us both." "They already hate me," she said simply. "At least now I will have chosen my ruin instead of letting them write it for me." Her nearness unnerved him. The scent of her, something like rain on stone, clung to the air between them. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, alien in stature, yet her loneliness was achingly familiar. He searched her face for a crack, a sign of manipulation, but found none. Only resolve. "I'm not strong," he admitted at last. "Not like your people. I'm not a warrior. I'm not even a leader among my own." "Perhaps that is why you are worthy," she murmured. Silence hung heavy. He felt the weight of two civilizations pressing down on the narrow thread that bound them together. To say yes would be madness. To say no would be betrayal, not of her, but of that moment in the hall when she had chosen him without fear. At length, he drew in a long breath. "If I agree, what happens next?" Her eyes softened, though the determination in them never dimmed. "Then you'll stand beside me, not as my weakness, but as my answer." The thought sent a chill through him, half fear, half exhilaration. He could not yet bring himself to speak the word she sought, but something inside him shifted. For the first time since he had arrived in the Empire, he was not invisible. He was seen. Outside the chamber, footsteps gathered. The Empress's envoys demanded her return. The moment between them stretched, taut and unfinished. She inclined her head, as though sealing a silent promise. "Think carefully," she whispered. "Tomorrow, the court will demand your answer." And then she was gone, leaving Daniel alone with the echo of her words, and the unbearable certainty that his life would never again return to the safe shadow of obscurity. The morning after the choosing dawned beneath a sky of pale fire, the Empire's twin suns rising over the crystalline towers of the capital. The palace buzzed with rumors carried by servants and scribes alike, rumors of madness, of rebellion, of scandal so deep it might crack the throne itself. Daniel walked the halls with the heavy tread of a condemned man, every step drawing stares sharp enough to pierce skin. No one spoke to him, but the silence was louder than words. He had been invisible before, now he was notorious. The council chamber filled with nobles adorned in armor gilded with gemstones, their disdainful eyes fixed on him. At the dais, the Empress sat cloaked in authority, her presence vast and merciless. Beside her, the princess stood unmoving, though the angle of her chin betrayed a defiance that had only sharpened overnight. When Daniel was summoned forward, the floor beneath his boots felt like a gallows. The Empress's words fell cold and precise. "Human, you were chosen. The insult cannot be undone without your refusal. Speak now, and this farce ends. Refuse, and you may leave with your dignity intact. Accept, and you must face the trial of worth. Do you understand?" The chamber hummed with anticipation. Daniel's superiors urged him silently from the benches, their faces pale. Yet when he turned his gaze to the princess, he found her watching him as she had before, steady, unwavering, not begging but believing. That gaze struck deeper than fear. He heard his own voice before he could stop it. "Understand." Gasps rippled through the nobles. Some laughed openly, others cursed under their breath. The Empress's eyes narrowed, a storm brewing in their depths. "Then you will be tested," she decreed. "If you fail, your union dies with your honor. If you succeed," she paused, her tone sharpened to a blade's edge. "If you succeed, then perhaps even a human may stand among us." That evening the trial grounds blazed with torchlight. The arena was older than the palace itself, its walls carved with the marks of countless contests. Spectators gathered, their voices rising in a tide of hunger for spectacle. To them, Daniel was a curiosity, a fragile creature tossed into waters meant for predators. They did not come to see him triumph, they came to watch him break. The first challenge was one of endurance. He was ordered to lift a weighted staff carved from a dense alloy that shimmered faintly with energy. Warriors of the Empire handled such burdens as training toys. Daniel's muscles screamed as he tried to raise it, arms trembling, sweat beading instantly at his brow. The crowd jeered, but instead of lifting it as they expected, he shifted his grip, using leverage against the arena wall to prop it upward. Awkward and inelegant, but upright. The judges exchanged looks of irritation, unwilling to call it a failure. The princess's lips curved ever so slightly, the faintest hint of approval. The second challenge was one of combat. A noble youth, armored and bristling with blades, stepped into the ring. Daniel's heart hammered. He could not hope to match strength with someone trained from birth to fight. The duel began with a roar, steel flashing under the torches. Daniel barely avoided the first strike, rolling across the sand, dust clinging to his clothes. The crowd laughed cruelly. Yet, as the noble advanced, confident in victory, Daniel's mind worked. He baited, retreated, used the arena's terrain as weapon. At one desperate moment, he flung sand into his opponent's eyes, slipping behind to force him down with the shaft of his practiced blade. Not graceful, not honorable by their standards, but effective. The noble fell, choking on dust. Shock silenced the crowd for a breath before fury replaced it. They called him dishonorable, cowardly, but he was still standing. The final challenge was one of judgment. A captive beast, scaled and wounded, was dragged into the arena, snarling and chained. The task was simple: end its life swiftly as a warrior should. The creature's golden eyes met Daniel's as it thrashed, bound, and helpless. He raised the blade placed in his hand, but something in him rebelled. He saw not a monster, but a prisoner, as trapped as he was. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the weapon. "I won't kill for spectacle," he said, voice ragged but clear. Outrage exploded in the stands. Cries of weakness and disgrace rained down. But the princess rose from her seat, her voice cutting through the chaos like a bell. "He refuses because he sees what you will not. Mercy where you demand cruelty. Courage where you see cowardice. You ask for proof of worth, here it is." The Empress's expression remained carved in stone, but the silence that followed was heavier than iron. Daniel felt the weight of every eye upon him, hatred mingling with reluctant curiosity. He had not won their admiration, but he had not broken either. He stood, bruised and breathless, but unbowed. When the trial ended, he was escorted back through the corridors, the sound of jeers still echoing faintly behind him. The princess walked beside him, her pace measured, her bearing unchanged. For a long time, neither spoke. At last, she turned her head slightly toward him. "They will not forgive you quickly," she said, "but you did not falter. That is enough." Daniel exhaled, his body aching, his thoughts tangled. "I don't know if it's enough," he admitted. "I only know I couldn't pretend to be what they wanted." She regarded him with something like quiet triumph. "You were never meant to pretend." Her words lingered as they entered the shadow of the palace, where torches burned low and the night stretched wide beyond the walls. He felt both heavier and strangely lighter, as though the trial had carved away the last of his invisibility. The court might despise him, but he had stood, and he had been seen. Yet even as the night deepened, he sensed the storm was not over. The Empire would not accept them easily. The Empress had not spoken her final judgment, and somewhere in the silence of those endless halls, he understood that what had begun as a single reckless question was already spiraling toward a reckoning far greater than either of them could yet imagine. The days following the trial bled into one another, heavy with silence and speculation. Daniel walked the palace corridors as though moving through a dream, trailed always by whispers. He was no longer invisible, but notoriety was a poor trade for peace. The nobles who had once ignored him now regarded him with open hostility. Guards watched him too closely, scribes paused mid-step to whisper curses, and his own fellow humans shrank from his presence, afraid his defiance would stain them all. Yet whenever he faltered beneath the weight of their disdain, he remembered the princess's unwavering gaze in the arena and the knowledge that he had not been alone. At last, the summons came. The Empress commanded their presence in the Hall of Judgment, a place more ancient and solemn than the choosing. Daniel entered beneath the soaring vaults of stone etched with histories of conquest. The Empress sat upon a throne carved from the fossilized remains of some colossal beast, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. The court gathered in restless silence, the tension thick enough to choke. "You stand at the edge of two worlds," the Empress declared, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "My daughter defies tradition. You defy expectation. I will not allow this farce to fracture the empire. Choose human. Renounce her and return to obscurity, or cling to her and be cast into ruin." The words struck like hammer blows. Daniel's mouth went dry. This was no test of strength or wit. This was politics sharpened to a blade. His survival demanded he step back, bow, and let her go. But when he looked at the princess, standing proud yet alone at her mother's side, he saw not ruin but the same fierce resolve that had pulled him from the shadows. To abandon her now would mean abandoning the one moment of truth his life had ever held. "I will not renounce her," he said, the words falling steady though his pulse thundered. Gasps rippled through the hall, followed by a wave of anger. The Empress's eyes hardened, and for a moment Daniel thought she would strike him down where he stood. But before she could speak, a thunderous crash shook the chamber. The walls trembled, dust raining from the vaulted ceiling. Shouts erupted as guards rushed to the doors. An enemy had come. Rival war clans, long festering at the empire's borders, had chosen this moment of weakness to strike. The court dissolved into chaos. Nobles shrieked, soldiers scrambled, and the Empress barked orders with fury in her tone. Amid the turmoil, the princess seized Daniel's arm. "With me," she commanded, pulling him through a side passage as explosions shuddered the air. They emerged onto a balcony overlooking the city. Flames licked at the crystal towers, ships screaming through the skies in combat. The Empire's capital, the heart of their might, burned before their eyes. Daniel's fear surged, but he forced it down. This was no arena trial. This was survival. The princess armed herself swiftly, retrieving a blade of shimmering alloy from a wall rack. She turned to him, eyes alight. "Stay behind me." But he shook his head. "No, I can't fight as you do, but I won't stand useless while your world falls." He scanned the city below, noting the panic crowds, the blocked streets, the chaos choking escape routes. Where she saw enemies to fight, he saw patterns in disorder, solutions hidden within the chaos. "Your people are trapped in their own defense lines," he said quickly. "If we can open a path through the old transport conduits, civilians can escape the fires. The soldiers are too scattered, they won't see it. But I can't." For a heartbeat, she studied him, then gave a sharp nod. Together they descended into the streets, the princess cutting down attackers with precision while Daniel guided terrified families toward the conduits, shouting instructions, clearing debris, forcing order into panic. At one point, he threw himself against a collapsing archway to hold it long enough for children to pass beneath, his arms trembling with the effort. Soldiers who had sneered at him only hours before now obeyed his shouted directions without hesitation. The battle raged until dawn, the sky painted in smoke and fire. When at last the enemy was repelled, the city lay scarred but unbroken. Word spread swiftly of the human who had stood beside the princess, who had saved lives not with strength but with quick thinking and unyielding courage. Where jeers had once followed him, now murmurs of respect stirred cautiously. Back in the Hall of Judgment, the Empress regarded them both with eyes like flint. The court had gathered again, battered yet alive, their arrogance tempered by fear of how close ruin had come. Silence pressed down until the Empress rose. "You defied me," she said to her daughter, her voice low. "You risked everything on a human." She turned her gaze upon Daniel, her lips tightening. And yet he did not fail you. A long, tense pause hung in the chamber. At last, with the weight of reluctant concession, the Empress spoke again. "Very well. If my daughter sees worth where none else will, then let her choice stand. The Empire will endure it and perhaps even learn from it. But remember, both of you, your union carries the weight of a throne. Fail, and the Empire will fall with you. The princess inclined her head, her voice quiet but resolute. "I will not fail." Daniel exhaled slowly, the enormity of what had just been granted sinking into his bones. He was not certain he believed in destiny, but standing there beside her, he felt something unshakable take root. He had not been chosen by birth or by station, but by her. Later, as the court dispersed and the echoes of the Empress's decree faded, they stood together in a quiet corridor overlooking the battered city. The dawn light filtered through shattered glass, gilding her features in pale fire. For the first time since he had met her, she allowed a smile to soften her proud composure. "They never chose me," she said softly, as though confessing a secret to the wind. Daniel turned toward her, his own weariness softened by the warmth in her gaze. "Then let them remember that you chose me, and I chose you." Her hand brushed his, tentative yet sure, and in that moment the weight of empires seemed almost bearable. The city still smoldered, the future still uncertain, but between them burned a bond that had already defied the impossible. And for the first time, Daniel believed it might just be enough. The days after the battle were a blur of rebuilding and uneasy silence. Smoke still curled from ruined spires, and the air carried the acrid tang of ash mixed with the faint sweetness of burned crystal. Workers labored in the streets, their voices subdued, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile calm. Daniel walked among them unnoticed now, not because he was invisible, but because he was spoken of elsewhere, in whispers that drifted like shadows through the palace halls. Some called him the human who had meddled in war. Others called him the human who had saved them. Either way, his presence was no longer denied. The princess remained at his side, though her bearing grew sharper each day. She wore the mantle of duty as though it had fused to her bones, commanding reconstruction efforts with a precision that silenced even her detractors. Yet Daniel could see the strain in her shoulders, the exhaustion hidden beneath her regal mask. At night, when they stole rare moments of quiet together, she let the facade slip, and he glimpsed the weight she carried. "They will never forgive me entirely," she said one evening as they overlooked the city's battered skyline. "Not for choosing you, not for surviving in a way that defies their pride. Every day, I must fight again for what we claimed in fire." Daniel listened, uncertain how to ease her burden. He was no politician, no strategist versed in the empire's labyrinth of power. Yet he had seen how quickly respect could be born in the heat of crisis, and how quickly it could wither in the cold light of recovery. "Then we fight together," he told her quietly. "You carry the throne. I'll carry whatever you can't." Their bond deepened in those stolen hours, yet around them, resistance hardened. The nobles who had once mocked her now plotted in silence, their pride wounded more deeply than their city walls. Rumors of assassination circled like vultures. Whispered poisonings, blades in the dark, alliances shifting with the fluidity of smoke. Even among the humans stationed at the palace, Daniel sensed unease. Some resented his rising influence, fearing his choices would draw vengeance upon them all. He was no longer merely one of them. He had become something else, and in that difference lay danger. The Empress remained a looming presence, her judgment suspended like a sword above them. Though she had permitted their union in the aftermath of battle, she had not blessed it. Her silence was not mercy, it was calculation. One evening she summoned Daniel alone, her chamber lit only by the flickering glow of memory crystals. She studied him for a long time before speaking, her voice as measured as a blade being drawn. "You have bound yourself to my daughter," she said. "You defied my will and survived trials meant to break you. But do not mistake survival for acceptance. My nobles hunger for your failure, and even among your own kind there are those who whisper you have betrayed them. Tell me, human, why should I not sever this knot myself and be done with it?" Daniel's throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Because she chose me," he said simply, "and because I chose her. Not for power, not for position, but because in a room full of people who never saw her, I did. If that is weakness, then let me be weak. If it is strength, then let it belong to us both." The Empress's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. At length she turned away, her silence colder than any condemnation. Daniel left the chamber with no clearer sense of his standing, only the sharpened knowledge that every day ahead would be a battle fought without certainty of victory. It was not long before the next blow struck. A council session called to oversee reconstruction spiraled swiftly into accusation. A noble rose, voice dripping with disdain, and declared that the princess's choice had brought ruin upon them, that her human consort had corrupted tradition and weakened the empire's spine. Murmurs of agreement rippled across the chamber. Another voice, harsher still, suggested that the trial had been manipulated, that no human could have endured it without deceit. The princess's fury was immediate, her words slicing through their accusations, but Daniel could feel the tide turning against them. No battle in the arena, no crisis in the streets could silence what pride refused to surrender. These men and women were bound by centuries of conquest, and he was a fracture in their narrative. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the vaulted ceiling above their chamber. He could hear the distant hum of the city's pulse, the faint roar of wind against the crystal walls. He thought of a life he had left behind on earth, a quiet, unnoticed existence. He had never sought greatness, never craved the burden of legend. Yet here he was tied irrevocably to a woman who had defied her world for him, and though the weight of that choice threatened to crush him, he could not bring himself to regret it. The princess stirred beside him, her hand brushing his. "You are awake," she murmured. "So are you." She turned her head, eyes glimmering faintly in the low light. "They will keep coming. The trials won't end just because we pass the first. Every day they'll find new ways to test us, new reasons to break us apart." Daniel clasped her hand, firm despite the tremor in his chest. Then, "Every day we endure." Silence lingered between them, filled with unspoken fears and fragile hope. Beyond the chamber walls, the empire shifted restlessly, waiting for its next storm. Yet in that quiet moment, with her hand in his, Daniel felt a faint spark of something unyielding, a defiance that had carried them this far, and might yet carry them further. The night stretched on, uncertain and unresolved, but when dawn came, they faced it together. And though the world outside sharpened its knives, neither of them turned away. The following weeks were marked by a tension that clung to every breath, every step, every exchange between the princess and Daniel. The empire was rebuilding, but the fractures in its foundation ran deeper than shattered stone. Markets reopened under the wary watch of soldiers, and towers once cloaked in smoke rose again, patched but not whole. Yet beneath the semblance of order, the nobility sharpened their grievances like knives in the dark. Each council meeting ended with veiled threats, each gathering of courtiers with whispers that carried just enough poison to sour the air. Daniel found himself caught between two fires. Among humans there was resentment. Some feared his connection to the princess would bring retribution down on them. Others envied the sudden prominence he had never sought. Among the empire's elite, suspicion curdled into open disdain. His every word was weighed for fault, his every movement scrutinized as if waiting for proof that he was nothing more than an intruder dressed in borrowed dignity. The princess defended him fiercely, but her defiance only deepened their hostility. It was during one of those fraught sessions in the council hall that the conflict crystallized. A noble draped in robes of deep crimson rose, his voice slicing the chamber like steel. "Your daughter's choice has compromised us," he declared, bowing stiffly to the empress before letting his eyes sweep the assembly. "Our enemies smell weakness. The bond she clings to is not one of strength, but a sentiment, and sentiment cannot shield an empire. How long before the humans, emboldened by one of their own at her side, rise against us?" A murmur rippled through the chamber, some in agreement, others wary of open challenge. Daniel's chest tightened, but he did not speak. This was not his arena, not yet. The princess, however, stepped forward, her voice clear and unflinching. "Do not mistake loyalty for weakness. He has stood where none of you would. He has shed blood when you sheltered in marble halls. If you cannot see the strength in that, then it is not he who fails the empire, but you." The exchange should have ended there, but the noble's lips curved in a thin smile. "Bold words, princess, but the empire's throne cannot be secured by boldness alone. It must be proven. If your consort claims worth, Let him demonstrate it not in shadows of battle or whispers of survival, but in the trial of command. The chamber erupted in voices, some urging restraint, others eager for spectacle. The Empress raised a hand, and silence fell like a shroud. Her gaze lingered on Daniel, heavy with unspoken judgment. "A test of command," she said at last, her voice deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Let the human lead, not in the council's safety, not in secret corridors, but upon the field where failure bleeds in lives, not words." Daniel's stomach lurched, but he did not look away. He understood what was being asked. Not a skirmish, not a symbolic contest, but a true command in war. The Empire's borders still smoldered with enemies eager to exploit its wounds. Sending him there was as much an execution as a trial. Yet when he glanced at the princess, her jaw clenched but her eyes steady. He knew retreat was not possible. That night, in the solitude of their chamber, she tried to dissuade him. "They want you to fail," she said, pacing like a caged storm. "They'll give you soldiers who don't trust you, resources too thin, orders meant to bind instead of guide. They would rather see you buried in the borderlands than standing here at my side." Daniel reached for her hand, stilling her restless movement. "I know," he admitted, "but if I refuse, they'll say I proved their point without even trying. And if I fall, then at least I fall standing beside you, not cowering behind your shadow." Her expression broke for a moment, the iron mask slipping to reveal fear, raw and unhidden. "I cannot lose you," she whispered. "You won't," he said, though doubt coiled in his chest. "Not if I remember why I'm there. Not for them, not for their approval, but for you, for us." The following dawn, he departed with a contingent of soldiers who regarded him with open skepticism. Their armor gleamed, their weapons hummed with energy, but their eyes said plainly they did not trust their human commander. Daniel mounted the transport with quiet resolve, ignoring the weight of their doubt. The princess stood at the platform's edge, her gaze locked with his until the vessel carried him from sight. The borderlands stretched before him like a scar, vast plains broken by jagged cliffs and ruins of long-forgotten wars. Enemy raiders had entrenched themselves in the region, preying on villages and striking supply lines. The mission was simple in words but deadly in truth. Drive them back, secure the border, and return alive. The first days were a trial of silence. The soldiers obeyed his orders mechanically, offering no counsel, no trust. Daniel leaned on observation, studying terrain, listening to the unspoken rhythms of his unit. He spoke little, but when he did, it was precise, deliberate, rooted not in authority, but in practicality. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, resistance softened. He redirected resources to protect vulnerable civilians instead of chasing empty victories. And when soldiers questioned him, he explained, not with arrogance, but with reasoning that held weight. The first battle came swiftly, an ambush in the ravine where jagged stone funneled them into the enemy's trap. Blades of light cut the air, and the ground shook beneath detonations. Daniel's instincts screamed to flee, but he forced his focus. He remembered the princess's words. Every trial was meant to break them. He would not break. He rallied the unit not by barking orders, but by calling them to their training, their discipline, their lives at stake together. They broke through, battered, but alive. And in the weary aftermath, something shifted. The soldiers looked at him not as an intruder, but as a commander who had bled beside them, who had chosen their survival over glory. Night fell over the borderlands, and Daniel sat by the dim glow of a field beacon, exhaustion gnawing at his bones. Around him, the soldiers moved with quieter steps, their voices carrying less scorn, more respect. The trial was far from over, the campaign still fraught with dangers, but he felt the first threads of trust binding them together. He lifted his gaze toward the horizon, where the sky burned faintly with the fires of distant skirmishes. Somewhere beyond, the princess waited, her fate tethered to his. He knew the court would not relent, the empress would not yield, and the trials would only sharpen from here. But in that moment, beneath the stars of a foreign sky, Daniel felt the stirrings of something greater than fear. Not victory, not yet, but possibility.